It was a warm Friday morning, December 13th, 2019, when Rashied Staggie stepped out of his home in Salt River. He climbed into his friend's Toyota Corolla Sedan and sat there for a moment. What he didn't know was that death was already watching, waiting, ready to stake its claim on his life. For years, Rashied had ruled the Cape Flats with an iron fist, feared by thousands and respected by those who dared to survive in his world. Alongside his twin brother, Rashied, he had built an empire that didn't just run the streets, they owned them. But that morning, someone decided it was time to end the story of Rashied Staggie once and for all. But bringing Rashied down was never going to be easy. What happened that morning would leave the entire nation stunned, and it's a story that will be spoken about for decades to come. This is the story of Rashied Staggie, his rise, his fall, and how he and his brother built South Africa's most powerful gang. Before he became one of the most feared figures in Cape Town's underworld, Rashied Staggie was just another boy born into a harsh world he didn't choose. His story begins in the early 1960s in a small, struggling suburb called Mafia, tucked away in the heart of Cape Town. Life there was tough, especially for a colored family like the Staggies. Opportunities were limited, and poverty clung to them like a shadow, always present, always reminding them of where they stood in a divided society. Rashied wasn't alone in this fight for survival. He had a twin brother, Rashied, and together they navigated a childhood that was anything but ordinary. Growing up during South Africa's apartheid era meant that the color of your skin determined where you could live, where you could go to school, and what kind of future you could dream of, if you dared to dream at all. Yet even the little stability they had in Mafia was ripped away from them. The South African government was determined to enforce segregation, and the Group Areas Act became the tool they used to destroy communities. Under this cruel law, families were forced out of their homes and relocated to areas that stripped away any sense of belonging. The Staggie family became just another number in this heartless system. They were uprooted from Mafia and dumped in Manenberg, a desolate township on the Cape Flats. What once was a familiar neighborhood filled with friends and memories turned into endless rows of cold, gray concrete blocks. Manenberg wasn't just a new address. It was a different world, one where violence, drugs, and crime became part of everyday life. Schools were overcrowded and underfunded. Job opportunities were almost non-existent, and everywhere you turned, survival felt like a game you were destined to lose. For young boys like Rashied and Rashied, it wasn't long before the streets became their classroom, teaching them lessons no school could ever provide. By the time they were teenagers, the Staggie twins had already seen more than most people would see in a lifetime. They watched their community sink deeper into poverty and hopelessness. Somewhere along the way, they came to a hard truth. No one was coming to save them. If they wanted to survive, they would have to take matters into their own hands. It started small, petty crimes here and there, stealing, hustling, doing whatever they could to put food on the table. It was dangerous, but in their eyes, it was better than going to bed hungry. Slowly, their names began to carry weight in the neighborhood. They weren't just two boys from Mafia anymore. They were becoming known for their street smarts, their courage, and their ability to stay one step ahead. By the early 1970s, Rashied and Rashied had built a reputation. People in Manenberg started to see them not as victims of their environment, but as rising figures in the community's growing underworld. And then, in 1971, while still in their teenage years, the Staggie twins made a decision that would shape their future forever. Together, they founded the Hard Livings Gang. The name wasn't chosen by accident. It reflected everything they had seen and lived through. Life in the Cape Flats was hard. It was unforgiving. And for the Staggies, leading a gang wasn't just about power. It was about survival in a world that had already written them off. The Hard Livings Gang quickly grew, attracting other young men who shared the same anger, the same hunger, and the same dreams of escaping poverty. Once the Hard Livings Gang found their footing in the streets of Manenberg, their hunger for power and money pushed them far beyond petty crimes. What started as small-time thefts soon grew into a sophisticated criminal empire, with operations that stretched across the Cape Flats and beyond. And at the heart of it all was the gang's ruthless ambition to dominate every illegal trade that could make them richer and feared. One of the biggest pillars of their empire was drug trafficking. The Hard Livings saw drugs not just as a quick way to make money, but as the key to controlling entire neighborhoods. They flooded the Cape Flats with heroin, cocaine, cannabis, and later crystal meth, better known as tick in South Africa. These drugs turned local communities into war zones. Young boys, barely teenagers, were used as runners, and as demand grew, so did the gang's pockets. But the drugs weren't their only weapon. The hard livings understood that power also came from firepower. They were known to stockpile heavy caliber firearms, smuggled through various channels, giving them an edge in gang wars. These weapons weren't just for defense. They were symbols of power, used to strike fear into anyone who dared challenge them. Whether it was a rival gang or a stubborn business owner refusing to pay, the threat of bullets flying was always there. In many cases, these guns spoke louder than words. The hard livings also tightened their grip on local businesses through extortion and protection rackets. Shop owners, taxi drivers, and even informal traders were forced to pay weekly or monthly protection fees to the gang. If they refused, their shops would be vandalized, their families threatened, or worse, murdered. The gang became a shadow government, taxing anyone trying to make an honest living in areas they controlled. And the police were often too scared, too corrupt, or too under-resourced to intervene. But the hard livings weren't satisfied with just local power. Their ambition went international. Tapping into South Africa's rich mineral wealth, they got involved in the smuggling of illegal diamonds. Through carefully crafted connections, they worked with foreign criminal organizations, including the notorious Sicilian Mafia. It was a lucrative partnership. While locals struggled to put food on the table, the hard livings were moving diamonds worth millions across borders. These deals gave them an international reputation, proving that they weren't just street thugs, they were businessmen in the world of organized crime. Despite all the crimes, violence, and illegal activities they were involved in, the hard livings gang knew exactly how to make themselves look like the heroes their community desperately needed. Rashied Staggie and his brother understood one important thing. Brute force alone wasn't enough to build an empire. If they truly wanted to control the streets, they had to win over the very people living in them. And that's exactly what they did. They turned their criminal organization into something the community could depend on. For many families struggling to survive, the hard livings became a lifeline. Rashied made sure of it. One of the gang's most powerful moves was simple but effective: financial support. Whenever families couldn't afford rent or were about to be evicted, the hard livings stepped in and paid their bills. Of course, there was always a catch. In return, loyalty was expected. And in a place where people had so few options, loyalty came easily. Some parents, left with no other choice, allowed their teenage sons to join the gang. For some, it was out of gratitude. For others, it was pure fear, but in the end, it didn't matter why. What mattered was that Rashied had created a system where survival felt tied to the gang. People felt like they owed the hard livings their very lives. But Rashied didn't stop there. He knew how to make people feel seen, even if just for a moment. Every now and then, the people of Monenberg witnessed a scene they would never forget. Rashied and his brother would roll through the neighborhood in flashy cars, windows down, music blasting, smiles wide, as they threw wads of cash into the air. Children screamed with excitement, running after the flying notes, while mothers and fathers scrambled to grab whatever they could. It wasn't just money falling from the sky. It was hope, even if it was temporary, and it worked like magic. The hard livings weren't just a gang anymore. They became part of the community's fabric. Young boys didn't just fear them. Many dreamed of joining them. To those growing up in poverty, the gang looked like a way out, a chance to gain power, respect, and a sense of belonging. Families relied on their support. Entire neighborhoods became safe havens for the gang. The police couldn't touch them, not because of their weapons, but because the very people living there were willing to protect them. By the time the hard livings reached the peak of their power, Rashied Staggie and his brother had built more than just a criminal empire. But no matter how big their empire grew or how many people they bought off, Rashied and his brother would eventually learn one painful truth: no amount of power can protect you forever. Because the streets never forget. While Rashied Staggie and his brother managed to silence some people by providing for their basic needs, there was still a large part of the South African community that completely rejected the hard livings gang and everything they stood for. And as the Staggie brothers grew in power, so did the anger within these communities. People were tired of burying their children, tired of watching their brothers waste away on drugs, and tired of feeling like prisoners in their own neighborhoods. The police were no help, corruption ran deep, and too often, the gangs operated without fear of consequence. It was only a matter of time before the people had enough. That breaking point came with the rise of a group called People Against Gangsterism and Drugs, better known as PAGAD. Formed in 1995, this movement was made up of local residents, religious leaders, and activists. Their mission was simple: to reclaim their streets from the grip of gangsters like the Staggie brothers. What started as peaceful marches and public prayers quickly turned into direct action. PAGAD wasn't willing to wait around for the government anymore. They were ready to fight back. Within a few months, PAGAD's numbers grew rapidly. Their protests became bigger, louder, and far more aggressive. Known drug dealers were dragged from their homes and beaten. Gang safe houses were torched. To some, Pagad became heroes, the vigilantes the community desperately needed. To others, they were dangerous radicals playing with fire. But for Pagad, the Staggie brothers weren't just another gangster. They were the symbol of everything they hated. They represented the face of organized crime in Cape Town. They were seen as the men who built their empire by feeding off the misery of their own people. Justice, it seemed, would not come from the government. If change was going to happen, the people would have to take matters into their own hands. And that's exactly, Pagad, they did. On the night of August 4th, 1996, the streets of Salt River were buzzing with a different kind of energy. Pagad had organized a march, a show of strength meant to send a message. Hundreds of members gathered, their faces filled with rage and determination. They were no longer just protesters. They were something else now, something dangerous. Rashied's brother, Rashied Staggie, made the mistake of underestimating them. Perhaps he thought he was untouchable. Maybe he thought his reputation alone would be enough to keep him safe. So he drove straight into the firestorm. As his white Mitsubishi pulled up near London Road, Pagad members spotted him immediately. The crowd turned into a wave of fury, surrounding his vehicle, shouting, pounding on the windows. Panic must have set in, but there was no escape. Within moments, the doors were wrenched open, and he was dragged out onto the street. Then came the gunshot. The first bullets tore into his body, sending him crashing to the pavement. Blood pooled beneath him, but the crowd was just getting started. What happened next was an act of pure, unrelenting rage. Someone doused his writhing body in petrol. A match was struck. Flames consumed him. They watched as the fire did its work, as the man who had once been untouchable was reduced to nothing but ash and memory. After the brutal death of his twin brother Rashied Staggie took full control of the Hard Livings gang. Fueled by grief and a determination to protect his brother's legacy, Rashied didn't just keep the operation running, he expanded it. Drugs, extortion, arms trafficking. If there was money to be made, the Hard Livings were involved. They were no longer just a street gang. They had become a powerful criminal empire. And at the center of it all was Rashied, pulling the strings and running the show like a true mastermind. But no king rules forever. As the new millennium approached, law enforcement agencies grew tired of Rashied's untouchable status. They watched his every move, waiting for the right moment to strike. That moment came in 2001, when Rashied made a fatal mistake, not just for himself, but for the entire Hard Livings organization. The chain of events that led to his downfall started with a 17-year-old girl from Mannenberg. She had once been close to the gang, but later chose to cooperate with the police. She became a state witness, ready to expose Rashied's dark world. For Rashied, this was the ultimate betrayal. No one, especially not a young girl, was allowed to turn their back on him and live to tell the tale. One night, Rashied and his men tracked the girl down. Armed and angry, they kidnapped her at gunpoint. What followed was one of the most disturbing crimes in the South Africa's gang history. Rashied ordered his men to assault the young girl, an act so cruel that it sent shockwaves across the country. He wanted to make an example out of her, a message to anyone else thinking of betraying him. But that night didn't end the way Rashied had planned. Instead of silencing her, she became the very reason Rashied Staggie's reign would finally start to crumble. The young woman, scarred but unbroken, reported the horrific assault to the police. Authorities acted quickly, and soon after, Rashied Staggie was summoned to court. What Rashied had hoped would silence her instead became a criminal case that would expose him like never before. The trial that followed was intense. In 2003, the judge handed down a 15-year prison sentence for kidnapping and orchestrating the assault. For the first time, the streets of Cape Town witnessed the fall of a man they once thought was invincible. But Rashied's problems didn't stop there. While serving his sentence, another case came back to haunt him. Years earlier, in 1998, Rashied had been linked to a daring burglary at the Fower Police Armory. It wasn't just a petty break-in. This was a full-scale operation aimed at stealing weapons and ammunition from the very force that was trying to bring him down. These stolen weapons had fueled many of the violent clashes between rival gangs on the Cape Flats. In 2004, Rashied stood trial once again. The court found him guilty of theft and possession of stolen firearms. Another 13 years were added to his sentence. However, the judge ruled that the new sentence would run concurrently with his existing 15-year term. Still, Rashied was officially buried in the system, his power fading with every day behind bars. While in prison, Rashied played the system carefully, attending rehabilitation programs, keeping his head down, and convincing the parole board that he was a changed man. By 2013, after serving just over a decade, Rashied was granted parole. It was a controversial decision that left many South Africans furious. A man responsible for terrorizing communities was walking free once again. The Department of Correctional Services claimed he had met all the conditions required for release. They said he was rehabilitated and ready to reintegrate into society. Still, the conditions of his parole were strict. Rashied was not allowed to contact known gang members, nor could he participate in any criminal activities. He was placed under constant supervision. After his release from prison in 2013, Rashied had tried to live a quieter life. At least, that's what he wanted the world to believe. He claimed to be a changed man, focused on rehabilitation, and even mingling with local community projects. But deep down, everyone knew that a man like Rashied Staggie could never truly walk away from the world he created. The Hard Livings gang was part of his blood. The money, the power, the connections, they were all still there, lurking in the background. As the years passed, rumors started swirling that Rashied had slowly made his way back into gang dealings. He wasn't the one pulling the trigger or moving the drugs anymore, but his influence was still strong. Some even said he was advising the younger generation of the Hard Livings, helping them expand their empire in ways he never could back in his prime. Whether those claims were true or not, it made Rashied a target once again. Whether those rumors were true or not didn't matter. What mattered was the growing belief that Rashied was still a threat, a shadow of the past that refused to disappear. And for some, that was enough reason to come for him. On December 13th, 2019, they finally struck. That morning, Rashied was sitting inside a white SUV parked outside his home. He was waiting for someone, or maybe just enjoying the familiar surroundings. Suddenly, two men approached the vehicle. Witnesses later said it all happened in a flash. There was no argument, no warning, just gunfire. The shooters unleashed a hail of bullets, hitting Rashied multiple times through the car window. By the time emergency services arrived, it was already too late. Rashied was rushed to Groote Schuur Hospital, but the doctors couldn't save him. He was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. And just like that, the man who once ruled the Cape Flats with an iron fist met a violent end in the same streets where his bloody journey had begun. The assassination sent shockwaves across South Africa. Some called it karma. Others saw it as the inevitable end of a gangster's life. But one thing was clear. Rashied's death wasn't random. It was a message, carefully planned and executed. Almost immediately, theories started flying around about who ordered the hit. Some believed it was the work of rival gangs, tired of living in Rashied's shadow. Others suspected it was an inside job, possibly even from members of his own Hard Livings gang, who wanted to cut ties with the old leadership and take full control. There were whispers about drug deals gone wrong and payback for old betrayals, but the truth remained buried deep in the streets. Police launched an investigation, but in Cape Town, solving gang-related assassinations was never easy. Witnesses were too scared to speak. No one wanted to be the next target. Days turned into weeks, then months, and still no arrests were made. The case grew cold, buried under the weight of Cape Town's endless gang violence. That was how the founder of South Africa's biggest gang met his end.